After World War II, America faced a choice. Punish the scientists who served Nazi Germany, or use them. Behind closed doors, the United States chose the second option. And the consequences would shape the Cold War, the space race, and the future of modern warfare. What you are about to witness is not a story found in standard history textbooks. It was buried beneath the layers of classified documents, redacted files, and deliberate institutional silence. The men at the center of this story built weapons that terrorized entire nations. They worked within a regime that committed crimes the world had never seen before. And yet within months of that regime's collapse, those same men were being quietly escorted into American laboratories, handed new identities on paper, and put back to work. Not punished, not tried, recruited. This is the story of Operation Paperclip, a program so secret, so morally complicated, and so consequential that its full weight is still difficult to comprehend today. Welcome to Grimoxa, where history's darkest secrets, forgotten empires, hidden operations, and unbelievable true stories come back to life. This is not the history they handed you in a classroom. This is the history that was buried in classified vaults, sealed behind government stamps, and kept from the public for decades. The stories that powerful institutions hoped would quietly disappear beneath the weight of time. But history does not disappear. It waits. Tonight, we uncover a secret deal born from the ashes of World War II. A deal struck in shadows, justified by fear, and executed with deliberate precision by the most powerful government on Earth. A deal that helped build the future of American science, military power, and space exploration. But left behind a question that history still struggles to answer, honestly. The program had a name, the files existed, the decisions were made, and tonight we open those files together. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was disintegrating. The nation that had once swept across an entire continent with terrifying speed was now crumbling from every direction. Allied forces were advancing from the west. Soviet armies were pushing hard from the east. And caught between those two unstoppable forces, the Third Reich, the empire that had promised to last 1,000 years, was collapsing in a matter of months. But beneath the rubble of that dying empire, something extraordinary had been quietly built. Something that neither the Americans nor the Soviets were willing to simply walk away from. Cut to visuals of underground tunnels, hidden facilities, and skeletal rocket frames rising in dimly lit chambers. Germany had developed weapons technology unlike anything the world had ever seen. Machines and systems that seemed to belong to a different era entirely. And the men who designed and built those weapons were still alive, waiting, and about to become the most valuable people on Earth. Germany's weapons programs were decades ahead of their time. The Volts 2 rocket was not just a weapon. It was the first man-made object to reach the edge of space, built in secret, launched in terror, and responsible for the deaths of thousands, both on the battlefield and in the slave labor camps that produced it. Let that last detail land for a moment. The scientists behind these programs were brilliant. They were also deeply embedded in a regime that committed some of the worst crimes in human history. These were not reluctant participants working from the shadows. Many held rank, many held authority, many knew exactly what was happening in the tunnels and camps where their designs were being assembled by prisoners who had no choice, no protection, and no future. The technology was extraordinary. The cost of building it was something else entirely. And that tension between genius and atrocity would follow these men across an ocean. As the war neared its end, American military intelligence received a warning. Soviet forces were moving fast. And they were not just looking for territory, they were looking for scientists. The race to capture Germany's most valuable minds had already begun. American military units moved with purpose through German towns, entering laboratories and securing documents. But this was not improvised. It was coordinated. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, operating under direct military authority, had a list. Names, locations, specializations. These were not ordinary prisoners of war. These were assets. Scientists who had spent years developing technology that neither side fully understood yet. Technology that could determine the outcome of whatever conflict came next. And both sides knew it. The Soviets were already moving toward the same facilities, the same names, the same laboratories. Every hour mattered. Every decision carried consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. The clock was running, and America was not willing to lose. In 1945, the United States government launched a classified program with a simple but deeply consequential mission: recruit German scientists, engineers, and technical experts. Bring them to America, put them to work. The program was called Operation Paperclip, named, according to some accounts, for the paperclips used to attach new biographical profiles to the files of men whose real histories had been quietly set aside. Think about what that means for a moment. These were not blank slates. These were individuals with documented pasts, documented affiliations, and documented roles inside one of history's most brutal regimes. And yet someone in a government office made a deliberate decision to clip a clean sheet of paper over those histories and move forward. At its peak, over 1,600 German specialists and their families were brought to the United States under this program. Most Americans had absolutely no idea it existed. The door had opened, and what waited behind it was far darker than anyone was prepared to publicly admit. To bring these men to America, their records had to be reviewed, and in many cases those records presented a serious problem. Several of the scientists on the list had been members of the Nazi Party, some had held ranks within the Schutzstaffel, some had direct knowledge of, or direct involvement in, the use of forced labor and concentration camp prisoners. The official policy stated that anyone with a Nazi background was ineligible, but the program found a way around that policy. Biographical summaries were rewritten, affiliations were omitted. In some cases, records were altered entirely. The men on those pages were not being judged by what they had done. They were being judged by what they could still do. The paperclip, it turned out, was not just a filing tool. It was a symbol of something being covered over, not erased, not confronted, simply set aside. And in that quiet act of omission, a much larger compromise had already begun. No name in Operation Paperclip carries more weight, more complexity, or more contradiction than Werner von Braun. He was a genius, a visionary, a man who dreamed of reaching the stars from the time he was a child. He was also a member of the Nazi Party and the Schutzstaffel. And the rockets he designed were built by concentration camp prisoners who worked in conditions that killed thousands of them. After the war, von Braun was brought to the United States. His record was reviewed, adjusted, and approved. Affiliations that should have disqualified him were quietly set aside. He was repackaged, reintroduced, and within years, he became one of the most celebrated figures in American science. Decades later, he would stand at the very center of the greatest technological achievement in human history, but the man the world celebrated and the man the records concealed were never fully the same person. That gap has never been closed. Beginning in 1945 and continuing through the early 1950s, German scientists arrived in the United States under carefully managed conditions. They were processed at military installations, photographed, assigned identification numbers, and distributed across facilities stretching from Fort Bliss in Texas to Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio to dozens of other installations scattered across the country. They were housed on base. Their movements were monitored. Their communications were controlled. They were in many ways both guests and prisoners simultaneously, but they were also working on missiles, on aircraft, on chemical and biological research programs, on the technical foundations of what would become America's entire Cold War military and scientific infrastructure. The American public was told very little about who these men were or where they had come from. What they were not told was considerably more. The machinery of secrecy was already operating quietly, efficiently, and in plain sight of almost no one. By the late 1940s, the world had changed completely. The alliance that defeated Nazi Germany had fractured almost immediately after victory. The Soviet Union and the United States were now locked in a new kind of war. Not fought with conventional armies crossing borders, but waged through technology, intelligence, and scientific supremacy. And the Germans were sitting right at the center of it. The Soviets had their own version of Operation Paperclip, their own captured scientists, their own classified programs running quietly behind the Iron Curtain. The race was never purely about territory or ideology, it was about knowledge, raw, dangerous, applicable knowledge. And both superpowers were absolutely willing to make deeply uncomfortable compromises to secure it. Early Soviet rocket tests sent a clear message to Washington. The question being asked inside American government offices was no longer who deserved punishment for wartime crimes. The question had shifted entirely. The question was now simply who could be useful. The most visible legacy of Operation Paperclip was not a weapon, it was a rocket. The Saturn V, the most powerful launch vehicle ever built, was developed under the leadership of Werner von Braun and a team that included veterans of Germany's wartime rocket program. On July 20th, 1969, that rocket carried American astronauts to the moon for the first time in human history. A moment watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. A moment that felt like pure triumph. But behind that triumph was a lineage that did not begin in Houston or Huntsville. It began in Peenemünde. It began in the tunnels of Mittelwerk, where prisoners worked and died building the very technology that would one day touch the stars. That contradiction does not erase the achievement. The moon landing was real. The courage of those astronauts was real. But the hands that built the machine that carried them there had a history that deserves to be remembered alongside the glory. Operation Paperclip was not only about space exploration. The scientists brought to America contributed to ballistic missile development, aviation research, chemical and biological weapons programs, and military intelligence operations. Some of their work formed the technical backbone of American military capability throughout the Cold War. These were not side projects or minor contributions, they were foundational. Entire departments within the United States military and intelligence apparatus were shaped by knowledge transferred directly from the Third Reich's most advanced research programs. Not all of these contributions were celebrated. Some remained classified for decades. Some are still not fully disclosed. The program touched areas of American military and scientific development that extended far beyond what was publicly acknowledged at the time. When people think of Operation Paperclip, they think of rockets and astronauts. But the full picture is considerably wider, considerably darker, and considerably more consequential than most people have ever been told. While the Nuremberg trials were prosecuting Nazi war criminals before the world, Operation Paperclip was quietly moving some of those criminals' colleagues into American research facilities. The contradiction was not lost on everyone. Some officials within the United States government raised objections. Some journalists asked questions. Some survivors of the camps that built the Volts 2 rocket tried to make their voices heard. But the program continued. The Cold War provided the justification. National security provided the silence. And for decades, the full extent of what had been done remained hidden from the American public. There was no public reckoning, no formal acknowledgement, no moment where the government stood before its citizens and explained the bargain it had made. The men who raised concerns were quietly sidelined. The men who had been recruited quietly continued their work. And the silence that protected the program was not accidental. It was deliberate, institutional, and absolute. What is confirmed is this. Operation Paperclip was real. It was authorized at the highest levels of the American government. It brought over 1,000 German specialists to the United States. Records were altered, backgrounds were obscured, and the program operated in deliberate secrecy for years. What historians continue to debate is the full extent of individual culpability, the precise degree to which specific scientists were aware of or complicit in war crimes, and whether the strategic benefits of the program genuinely justified the moral compromises it required. These are not questions with clean answers. They sit at the intersection of history, ethics, and power. Declassified documents have revealed more than officials ever intended the public to see, yet critical gaps remain. Some files are still restricted, some testimonies were never recorded. The people who made those decisions believed, at the time, that they had no other choice. Whether history agrees with them is a question that remains deliberately unresolved. Operation Paperclip was not just a secret program, it was a choice between justice and advantage, between punishment and progress, between remembering the crimes of the past and using the people who helped make them possible. America chose to build the future, and it did. The rockets flew, the satellites launched, the moon was reached. But none of that erased what came before it. None of it silenced the workers who died in the tunnels beneath Mittelwerk. None of it answered for the records that were quietly rewritten in government offices while the world was still counting its dead. The question Operation Paperclip left behind has never fully been answered. Can a nation build the future by burying the past? The rockets reached the sky, but the shadows behind them never truly disappeared. If you enjoy cinematic documentaries about hidden history, secret operations, and the mysteries governments tried to bury, subscribe to Grimoxa. Until next time, keep questioning.